every 20 years, Issei Shrine is rebuilt, not as something new and different, but as something new, but like it was. And I'm not convinced, having heard the previous lecturer, that he is even interested in the terms of Skia, or can even understand it if he were to be shown it. Because there's a different culture that exists in architecture than in the generalities of contemporary otherness of thought. And so I want to talk tonight about those conditions that exist in architecture, maybe stemming from something like Skia or the tea house at Katsura Palace. I say that because I'm going to speak about two terms. One, the term project, and the other, the term practice. And I'm going to speak for a few minutes about these terms, and then I'm going to show two of my projects. And I do that because the Italian architectural critic and theoretician Manfredo Tofuri said to me very poignantly once, "Peter, you have a fantastic project, but if you hadn't built, no one would care." And so while I continue to develop a project in a very humble way, I also realize the need to practice, to build the things that I think about when I'm concerned with project. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about project, and then I'm going to show you practice of project, and then leave it for a discussion that I'm certain will follow with Professor Quinter. What you should realize, since we have been friends for so many years, there's an enormous rivalry between two institutions in the United States. Perhaps like the rivalry between the two best universities in the Far East, Tokyo and Osaka. So too, two of the best universities in America, Harvard and Yale, have an enormous rivalry. What's interesting is that Professor Quinter now, after many years as a wanderer, has found a home at that institution called Harvard, and has probably given him a new kind of sense of certainty, because I've never heard him use the terms must and should in his speech before. And these two terms have suddenly come into a place because, as we all know, Harvard is number one and Yale is number two. I've always been in a position to use a Japanese phrase of being an ozeki, attempting to be a yokozuna. I don't think that Yale will ever be more than a training ground of ozeki, and I think that Harvard has always felt itself to be a place where the yokozuna live. And so that would describe a little difference between Professor Quinter and myself. Excuse me. What do I mean by project? A quick metaphor, I think, would be useful. An architectural project is one where the architect defines the world he or she lives in, whereas a practice is one in which the world defines the architect. Both are viable ways to think about the world. Some people are not interested in defining the world, and others are not interested in having the world define you. It doesn't depend on talent or intelligence. It doesn't depend upon whether you can design or not. It rather depends on how you see yourself in relationship to the world. Sustainability, environment, parametrics are not a project. They are a way the world defines you as an architect. What is a project? The Roman architect Borromini, which is one of the most important architects in the world and history, had a project, while the architect Bernini had a practice. Yet Bernini was one of the most successful and powerful architects the world has ever known, while Borromini had just a few buildings. In fact, Borromini was so upset about his relationship to Bernini and the traditional sense of power that was evoked by Bernini's work that Borromini, in desperation, took his own life. To come closer to the present day, I would argue that Aldo Rossi, the Italian architect, had a project, while the famous British architect, James Stirling, had a practice. I could also say that Aldo Rossi had a project and Norman Foster had a practice. Robert Venturi had a project. I.M. Pei had a practice. What is interesting to me is that, in fact, the histories of architecture, after they are sorted out from their present mediations, in a sense, are always built on the people that have had a project. And that most people who have had a project in one way or another not only have been recorded in history, but have recorded the history of how they define society at the time of their project. If we look, for example, at Le Corbusier in the 1920s and 30s, there were a lot of French architects, such people as Rodinal et Stevens, André Lossa, and others, who were doing little white houses at the same time as Corbusier. So it wasn't a question of the little white houses. In fact, it was a question of the attitude toward those houses that was manifest in Le Corbusier's writing and thinking. In fact, Le Corbusier wrote down the principles of a modern architectural project with his 5 points and his 4 compositions. Had he not written those books, Vers une Architecture, the magazine Esprit Nouveau, no one would really look at those little white houses today. The same thing, I would argue, could be said of Andrea Palladio, the famous architect of the 16th century, who had, in fact, a project. But there were a lot of architects doing villas in the Veneto in the 16th century and throughout Italy. Yet Palladio chose, at the end of his life, to write a book. The 4 books, in fact, of architecture, where he described and redrew the houses that he had built as he wanted them to be remembered as his project. So he defined in this book the difference between project and practice. The building of the houses was important, but they were his practice. They were defined for him by his clients. His project defined the world of those houses as Palladio wanted them to be known. When I move, does this move this forward? Whoop, no? I know, I'm always confronted with technology. Tonight, I want to define something more than the idea of project. I want to talk about the idea of a meta-project. That is, a discourse that transcends the particular definition of the world by the architect, but that lasts beyond the influence and aura of that architect. And I want to postulate that Western architecture, and we could probably do the same thing for Japanese architecture, but that Western architecture is defined by 6 meta-projects. That is, projects which transcend their own particular time and place. The first meta-project, I would argue, was Vitruvius's 10 books in architecture, written in the 1st century AD, and was the touchstone from which all other treatises that followed for 15 centuries were written. In fact, Vitruvius was the first one to write a categorical treatise, setting down consciously what was involved in the discipline that would become known 15 centuries later as architecture.